Mr. Chairman, our nation is weary of war. We've been at war for over a decade in two main countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't think we're eager to get into another war. I talk to our young men and women who have volunteered to fight in war. I think it's not a good idea to get involved in Syria. I think it's a very murky war with so many different factions that it's hard to know who are our friends, who aren't our friends, who you should arm, who you shouldn't arm. I don't think anybody can sit here in Washington and say, well, I'm confident these weapons are only going to good, liberty-loving, Jeffersonian, type of Democrats in Syria, and that bad people aren't going to get these weapons. So I'm very concerned about giving weapons. I think also, when you think about the amendment that I'm offering, the First Amendment, it clarifies that the 2001 use of authorization of force does not authorize intervention in Syria. This is stating another way what we are already stating in the bill, that this is not a use of authorization of force. But it goes to the heart of the debate we're going to have, that Senator Corker has talked about having, about the definition of the original use of authorization of force in Afghanistan that's come to mean anything. And I think it's important that we state explicitly what we think it means. There is a great irony here in the sense that if you wanted to believe in an expansive definition of the 2001 use of authorization of force, it says go after al-Qaeda and associated forces. Well, al-Qaeda and associated forces are opposing Assad. So if you want to believe in an expansive definition of the 2001 AUMF, you might believe that you could actually support Assad with arms, that the original use of authorization of force actually would justify giving arms to Assad. And I'm not proposing that. But I am proposing that you will be giving arms to the side that is fighting against Assad that has elements of al-Qaeda. There is a great irony there. I am also saying that in your rush to get involved in Syria, that you may well be arming Islamic rebels who will be shooting Christians. There's about somewhere between 1 million and 2 million Christians in Syria. They have been largely protected by Assad. I'm once again not saying Assad's a good guy, but I'm saying that they've been a protected minority by Assad for decades because he's a minority and it's been practical for him. They haven't taken a large position in the war. They're in the middle of this, but they tend to live in areas and have been protected by the Assad regime. When push comes to shove, I think there'll be a great irony and tragedy and sadness if you've sent arms with U.S. taxpayer money to kill Christians. I think it could happen. I think it's impossible to know who our friends are. Look at how much trouble we have in Afghanistan. We have an ally that we've had for 10 years, and we don't know who to trust in the Afghan army. We've had probably nearly 100 deaths from Afghan soldiers. They lie. They come in and say they're our ally, and they take a pledge to support us, and we turn the other way and they shoot us. And Syria is a much messier situation, maybe 100 times messier than Afghanistan is. I know everybody here wants to do the right thing, but I think it's a rush to war. Now, people will say, oh, you're not putting troops on the ground. Well, we are going to have capacity building. There is no limitation in this bill on where those troops can do capacity building. I'm assuming it's going to be more in Jordan and other places. But there's no limitation here that the troops, U.S. troops, can't be on the ground in Syria. So this resolution could be arming rebels, who even the Joint Chief of Staff have said it's unclear, and it's increasingly unclear who our friends are, and it's increasingly difficult to determine who our friends are. He says in the last 6 months, it's become harder to determine who our friends are. This is the Joint Chief of Staff, who I would think would be privy to a lot of information and whose opinion and weight should be listened to carefully. So I'm very concerned about arming the rebels. I'm concerned about getting more involved. I'm concerned about the slippery slope into war. War doesn't always start with a huge battle or bombing run. Sometimes it starts with advisors. It did in Vietnam. Sometimes it starts with arming one group for the other. People may remember in Vietnam we had trouble because we didn't like some of the leaders. They were either corrupt or not good enough fighters, and so we got rid of Diem, or we let others get rid of Diem, or we watched over that. But we were always trying to look for better leaders, people who were stronger leaders. But the ones who emerge may well not be the ones we like. We think we can change the outcome. I'm not sure we can. But there will be a great tragedy if American arms fall into al-Nusra and to extremist elements in Syria, and I really regret that. I will vote against the entire bill, but I would like to present mine for a recorded vote, which basically says that the use of authorization of force from 2001 does not authorize intervention in Syria. You've already agreed to have this stated in a different way in the bill, that this bill doesn't do it, but now we're going to say, if you vote for this, that you believe that the use of authorization of force really had a little bit to do with Afghanistan, which I think it was primarily intended to, and that the language does not authorize war and intervention anywhere in the world anytime.
Mr. Chairman, if I could.
Senator Corker.
First of all, I appreciate the comments of the Senator from Kentucky, and I know he's been, in this mode from day one, and I appreciate the way he expresses himself. I will say that the bill does clearly state that we're not authorizing the use of military force. And there is no question that I'd like to see that debate. I know Senator McCain, myself, several other senators have met to discuss the authorization that now is in place. It's 60 words. It was put in place on September the 18th. And when I traveled through North Africa, it was very difficult to connect that authorization with the activities that we all know are taking place or will be taking place. So I agree we need to have that debate. I think what attaching your amendment to this bill would do, though, it would have an unintended consequence of basically saying that Syria is the one place that al-Qaeda operatives could go to and be untouched. And I know that's not what you're attempting to do here, but in essence, by saying that the authorization that we passed on September the 18th, 2001, by saying that it does not apply here, what that would mean is those very al-Qaeda affiliates that we'd like to go after could not be touched in this state. And if I could keep going for just 1 second. Your comments about the Christians in Syria and the Alawites, they're very close to each other and they support Assad today. I think one of the things that we know is that if the extremists, the al-Nusra and other groups, if they succeed, there's almost a positive guarantee that they will be exterminated. And I think what we're trying to do is to change that balance so that the moderate secular groups at least have a chance. There are plenty of arms flowing into Syria, there's no question. And I agree that some of the arms that we pay for will likely end up in places that we would like for them not to end up. But the arming is part symbolic. I think we are the only nation in the world that has the ability to coordinate the communication, the humanitarian aid, and those things with the countries, the surrounding countries, those things that might shift this balance. So I appreciate your concerns. I do think this will have an unintended consequence of making it a safe haven for al-Qaeda, and I don't think that's what any of us would like to do, and I will oppose the amendment.
But here's the question I have, Senator Corker, is that we're actually arming the side of al-Qaeda. You know, the great irony is that the use of authorization of force said we could go after al-Qaeda, and you're worried about being limited from going after al-Qaeda, but at the same time we're passing a resolution where you're actually sending arms to the same side of a war as al-Qaeda is on the same side of the war. So the real irony is, if you believe in expansive definition of the original use of authorization of force, you would actually be able to send arms to Assad because Assad is fighting al-Qaeda. That's what makes this thing so confusing and why we ought to really, I think, stop and pull back.
Yeah, I don't find it that confusing. I think what we've understood is, and I think Senator Rubio actually has done a very good job of articulating this in the committee, is it's the second war now that is of greater concern even than Assad, and that is who is going to control the country the day after Assad. By sitting on our hands and not getting involved in a little different way, it's almost assured that the group you're talking about, al-Qaeda, or at least extremists with similar views, will control the country. That's what we're trying to not do. And I want to add, we have all kind of provisions in here about man pads and the types of activities that have to occur before any type of anti-aircraft, whether it's mounted on the back of a Jeep or on a shoulder, can be utilized. So I think there are a lot of safeguards here. I understand your concerns, and I appreciate the way you articulate them. I do think this amendment would be destructive to the bill and to our national interest.
Anyone else seeking comment on Senator Paul's amendment? Yes.
Thank you, because I think Senator Paul's amendment goes to the heart of this entire debate about this issue. So there are 4 quick points I wanted to touch. The first is, I would not support this bill here today if it did not read specifically to say, nothing in this act shall be construed as providing authorization for the use of military force by the United States Armed Forces. Meaning, if this thing was going to become the next Afghanistan or next Iraq, I would not support this, nor do I think this committee would support it, because no one wants to see another conflict like that, nor, quite frankly, do I think we need it in order to accomplish our national security goals. The second point I think I'd want to address is this notion of the side of al-Qaeda. I'm not sure that's an accurate description of the conflict that's on the ground. This is not the War of 1812, where there's two clearly defined sides going after each other. This is basically a loose conglomeration of different groups operating. They share one goal, which is getting rid of Assad, but the reason why they all want to get rid of Assad is so they can be in charge, and so they started fighting with each other in that regard as well. And so I think that's important to state. The third point I'd make on the shedding of the blood of Christians, I would say two things. First of all, I think that Assad has plenty of blood on his hands, including the blood of Christians. Syria has basically been a way station for some of the most horrifying terrorist groups in the world who have carried out attacks against America's interests and against innocents, not just Christians, all over the world. The second point I would make is that as far as arming or being involved in this conflict, that's why the vetting is so important. Because we do want to make sure we're not arming people that are going to turn around and use those weapons to slaughter not just Christians, but any innocents. In essence, we don't want our weaponry or our things that we're providing to be used to commit human rights violations. And so I think that's why the vetting components of this are so critical. The last point I would make, and I think I'll say it now because I think it's going to apply to a number of these amendments that we're going to have today. Syria is awash in weapons. There are weapons everywhere in Syria. The problem is that the people who are best armed and best equipped in Syria are the ones that are willing to deal with the radical elements of the world. So if you're basically willing to deal with the most radical elements out there, they will equip you, they will arm you. And so it's almost a perverse incentive for some of these groups to become closer, even whether they privately agree with them or not. It's almost a perverse incentive for some of these groups to say, I'm going to get friendlier to the most radical groups in the world because they'll arm us. And so that's the problem here. One of the fundamental problems that we face is that, in a sense, the place is full of weapons, but the best armed guys, the guys who have the easiest access to weapons and machinery and equipment, are the ones who are willing to go counter to the direction we want them to go. We don't want to see a situation there where the best armed groups are the ones that are willing to deal with the most violent and radical groups out there. The last point I would make touches upon what Senator Corker pointed out. What is happening in Syria today is that basically, even with the gains that the Syrian government under Assad has been making over the last few weeks, it's largely an effort to consolidate its power in a geographic base. In essence, the country is de facto already kind of divided in areas where the government, I don't think, has a reasonable chance to ever recover. And as a result, what could really happen here is these vast ungovernable spaces within Syria that will be used as an operating base for al-Qaeda and radical elements like them that look for places like that where there isn't a government, there isn't police officers, so they can go in there and basically take over the land and use it the way they've used the Fatah and other parts of the world. And if this amendment were to pass, the second part of it that deals with the authorization for use of military force, what it would basically mean is what Senator Corker said. We know that al-Qaeda has set up a terrorist camp. They're training people in Syria, for example. We would not have the authority to go in there and go after them. It would become one of the few places on earth that's actually a proclaimed safe haven. So I think that's where the amendment, so I think half the amendment is right on point. It restates what's already in the bill. The other half, I think, creates an unintended consequence.
Final word, Senator.
You know, one comment I would say is that one thing about Assad is that Assad never really tolerated al-Qaeda. By defeating Assad, you will embolden al-Qaeda. Second point I would make is that the Christians, many of them came voluntarily into Syria. So Assad is not a great guy. I mean, Assad is a dictator and authoritarian like so many are in the Middle East and around the world. But I think it's important to remember, though, that Christians came voluntarily out of a country, Iraq, where we won the war and an Islamic government was instituted, and they felt safer under Assad. 250,000 Christians fled Iraq during and after the war to come to Syria. There are 2 million Christians, somewhere between 1 million and 2 million Christians in Syria, and they're there because that's the one area they have felt the safest. They're more there than even in Israel. So I think that we need to be careful about what we're doing here because we are siding with the people, against Assad, who was one who limited al-Qaeda. He didn't tolerate al-Qaeda because it was a religious difference, and they were limited when he could, when he had the power to, by al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is emboldened. Iran is emboldened by the loss of the Sunni government in Iraq. And I'm not saying Hussein was a good guy either, but what we're setting up is maybe a situation where what, I know you're all well-intentioned, but maybe what occurs out of this is less stability and more free reign for al-Qaeda, and that's my concern.
I appreciate the senator's views. He has been consistent in his views on some of these issues. However, I strongly disagree with him. 1.5 million people who have been displaced, 80,000 who are dead. Hezbollah, Iranian Guard. I think that a good part of overall the Syrian population is at risk. And finally, I would just reiterate us specifically to the amendment. Section 5 specifically states that nothing in the act shall be construed as providing authorization for the use of military force by the U.S. Armed Forces. So I believe this amendment is unnecessary and actually creates, for some of the reasons my colleagues said, a greater challenge. With that, since the senators asked for a roll call vote, I ask the clerk to call the roll.
Mrs. Boxer?
Mrs. Voxer votes no by proxy.
Mr. Pardon?
No by proxy.
Mr. Casey? No. Mrs. Shaheen? No. Mr. Coons?
No by proxy.
Mr. Durbin?
Not voting.
Not voting.
Mr. Udall? Mr. Murphy? Mr. Kane? No. Mr. Corker?
No.
Mr. Risch?
No.
Mr. Johnson?
No by proxy.
Excuse me. Mr. Rubio?
No.
Mr. Flake?
No by proxy.
Mr. McCain? Mr. Barrasso? No. Mr. Paul?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman?
No.
2 ayes, 15 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Is there any other amendments offered?